April 9th, 1990, Moscow. It had been a cold spring in the troubled Soviet capital, but the Cold War at least was coming to an end. It had been 6 months since the Berlin Wall fell, 4 months since the execution of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. Eastern Europe was shaking off dictatorial rule, and so was the Soviet Union. How much was changing? Change can be measured in many ways. Here's one. The Reverend Myung had arrived on a visit to Moscow. It was an astonishing reversal of old habits and attitudes.
The Reverend Myung, founder of the World Media Association, the Summit Council for World Peace, and the Association.
The controversial religious leader would in Moscow speak to an assembly of former heads of state and international journalists on April 9th, 1990. Even more remarkable, the next day Reverend Moon would meet with President Mikhail Gorbachev in the Kremlin. The two men were supposed to be arch enemies, but they weren't, at least not this time. On April 11th, the Korean children's folk ballet, The Little Angels, a company founded by Reverend Moon and his wife, would perform for the Soviet Union's First Lady, Raisa Gorbachev. It too was another first. What lay behind these extraordinary events? Why had Reverend Moon come to Moscow in the first place? And why did the Soviet leader see a man who had fought communism nearly his whole life? For years, the official Soviet press had labeled the Korean the world's leading anti-communist, and worse. In April 1990, it would be different. This is the story of that trip, a journey of peace and reconciliation in a rapidly changing and still dangerous world. To understand all this, it's necessary to go back to the beginning of Reverend Moon's mission and how it came about. He was born 70 years ago, January 6, 1920, in a small village, Jeongju, in what is now North Korea. In that year, the struggling Soviet Union was racked by civil war. In America, it was a time of peace and disillusionment. Woodrow Wilson lay stricken in the White House, and Warren Harding would be elected president, promising a return to normalcy. Elsewhere, it was not so peaceful. Korea for a decade had been occupied by the Japanese, and even in the poor hamlet of Jeongju, which lay close to the Yellow Sea, the Moon family had experienced the harsh rule of Japan firsthand. The Moons were poor farmers and had been so for centuries, tilling the soil in hard labor and stoic patience. At the turn of the century, however, a profound change took place in all of their lives. They had become fervent Christians, Presbyterians, thanks to the work of American missionaries. But the Moon family, like all other Koreans, could not then practice their Christian faith in peace, not in 1920 at least. The occupation government allowed no other religion except Shintoism. That restriction was only one part of a deliberate policy which sought the complete obliteration of the Korean identity, a culture, language, and history that had bound these people for 5,000 years. But for the young Moon, Japanese persecution only stimulated a search for God, to experience Him in a deep and personal way. And like other religious leaders, from Moses to Muhammad, who grew up in troubled times, that search for God was driven by great human suffering. For the young man, it was the simple but ageless question, why was there so much evil in the world? The answer came when Myung Moon was 16. On Easter morning 1936, the young Moon was praying on a mountainside near his village. There, he says he saw Jesus of Nazareth. In that vision, he heard Jesus tell him to continue the work left unfinished nearly 2,000 years ago. That command, to bring peace to the world, stunned the young Moon. At first he refused, but in the end he accepted. Like St. Paul, Myung Moon knew he was not ready to begin his mission quite yet. For 9 years, Myung Moon read his Bible and prayed for God's guidance and revelation. In 1945, after the defeat of the Japanese and the liberation of the Korean peninsula, he would begin. It would not be an easy task. Sun Myung Moon was convinced he should start in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, already occupied by Soviet troops. But the North Korean government, which was militantly atheistic, allowed no religious freedom. Like the Japanese before them, the North's new rulers were in no mood to compete in the arena of ideas. As a result, in August 1946, Reverend Moon was arrested and jailed for the first time. It would not be the last. There, he would be beaten and tortured and left for dead after being tossed into the prison yard. Later, Reverend Moon's few followers carried him away and restored him to health. Some said his recovery was a miracle. Soon, the young Reverend Moon was back preaching his message, ignoring the total ban on religious teaching in the North. And once again, he was in trouble. That was April 1948. For preaching God's word in Pyongyang, Reverend Moon would be sent to Hungnam, a slave labor camp reserved for the regime's most dangerous enemies. Prisoners were deliberately worked to death. Few lasted more than 6 months. Reverend Moon endured it for nearly 3 years. Reverend Moon knew he could not survive on his will alone. Given a starvation ration, he gave half of it to his fellow prisoners. Then he prayed for strength and increased his will to live. That determination helped others. Some would survive, others would die. But Reverend Moon gave his fellow prisoners what comfort he could. Then, on June 25, 1950, everything would change once again. On that day, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, determined to unite the two Koreas by force. Kim Il-sung failed, but only because President Truman ordered American forces to the rescue. More than 1 million people lost their lives, and millions more would become refugees. For Reverend Moon, the North Korean lunge for the South meant eventual liberation from Hungnam. Thanks to General MacArthur's daring and unorthodox amphibious landing at Incheon in September, the North Korean army found itself in full retreat. American B-29s were bombing targets further and further to the north. Hungnam was one of them. 1 month after the retaking of Seoul, U.S. forces overran Hungnam. They were just in time. Reverend Moon and the remaining prisoners were to be executed the following day. The North Koreans wanted no witnesses. Now free, Reverend Moon refused the safety of the South and returned to Pyongyang searching for members of his congregation. There weren't many left. With his 2 remaining followers, they eventually headed south to safety after 1 million Chinese volunteers crossed the Yalu River, sweeping the UN forces back down the peninsula. In the dead of winter, Reverend Moon carried an injured disciple on his back over 600 miles of rugged terrain on icy roads jammed with refugees. Their destination? Busan. Busan was a human disaster, crowded with the homeless and the beaten troops of a dozen nations. The city was once again the last redoubt of non-communist Korea. For Reverend Moon, it meant hard work as a dockhand, earning just enough to survive for him and his flock. He slept where he could. But despite the poverty, Reverend Moon continued to preach his message of hope. Only a few listened. Those who did soon built the first Unification Church on a barren hillside near Busan. It wasn't a glistening temple of alabaster and gold. Instead, it was a simple hut made of rock and mud and old army ration boxes. Reverend Moon told his followers that with God all things were possible, and in this new age there would be peace on earth and mankind would live in the love of God. In the spring of 1951, that promise seemed only a dream. 3 years later, after an uneasy peace began in Korea, Reverend Moon formally founded his church. It carried an imposing, if not unusual, name. It was the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. And yet the new Unification Church began to spread beyond Korea, first to Japan, and then to the rest of the world. In 1960, Reverend Moon married Miss Hak Jahan. That marriage of 30 years has produced 13 children and as many grandchildren. And while the family was growing, so was his church. In 1971, Reverend Moon came to the United States. The United States, like Korea and Japan, came to have a special significance in his thinking. To him, America had been responsible for defending South Korea from aggression, and for that he was grateful, and said so. But he also believed that God expected much more from the American people. It was clear to Reverend Moon that in the 1960s and 70s, the United States had drifted from its founding ideals and was in danger of losing sight of them altogether. The man from Korea would not let that happen if he could help it. Consequently, Reverend Moon toured the country, speaking in all 50 states in his Day of Hope campaign. He spoke to an overflow crowd in Madison Square Garden and later Yankee Stadium, repeating his message in pursuit of his mission. He spoke to all, both high and low, to anyone who would listen. He was invited to the White House by President Nixon at a time when the president was embroiled in the Watergate scandal. Reverend Moon also addressed members of Congress, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Earlier, he had met with former President Dwight Eisenhower and other world leaders, including the Japanese Prime Minister and the leaders of Vietnam, seeking reconciliation at a time of international confrontation. The Day of Hope campaign continued in Japan and Korea in 1975, concluding with an enormous rally of 1.2 million people in his native land. By the end of that year, Reverend Moon would send out missionaries to 135 countries. The Unification Church had become a world movement. But America remained at the heart of his mission. In that country's bicentennial year, 1976, Reverend Moon organized the largest religious rally ever held in Washington, D.C., on the grounds of the Washington Monument. More than 300,000 people of all creeds and colors came to that gathering. There, he preached his message of one world under God. He also prophetically proclaimed the end of communism. His startling prediction? He would go to Moscow to speak to the Soviet people.
그러한 결의의 목표는 뭐냐면 이제 공산 모스크바에 있어서 세계적 대회를 하는 날이 남아있다 이거예요.
So then, from this time we solemnly declare, we have an additional goal, another step to go. That is, next goal is indeed the Moscow.
But Reverend Moon's long-held opposition to communism as an ideal gone wrong contained no hatred or fear of the people living in communist states. As he put it in a recent interview with the Soviet press, I cannot conceal from you that for 40 years I have been opposed to Marxism. It is not because I hate Karl Marx. Karl Marx was right to decry human suffering and exploitation. But at the same time, Marxism asserts there is no God, whereas my vivid spiritual experience has shown me that God exists and that there is nothing more important than finding and knowing His heart. It was a blunt message, and it had never changed. Reverend Moon was calling for a reconciliation of peoples, but he would not compromise on principles. No real good can happen, he believed, until a spiritual revolution took place within each human heart. Bigotry, war, poverty, the destruction of the world's environment are finally a problem of human evil, and only God and His love can cure that sickness. But that message needs a medium. In Reverend Moon's case, there would be many ways to tell the story. In 1976, he established News World Communications and its two daily newspapers in New York, the New York City Tribune and the Spanish-language Noticias del Mundo. In 1982, the Washington Times was founded. From the beginning, the Times was seen as a feisty and hard-hitting competitor to the powerful Washington Post. Its editor, Arnaud de Bourgrave.
We have broken countless stories since I've been here that you will not find in other major media outlets to such a degree that they have had to pick them up from us and give us credit for them. When I was in Europe recently, I was delighted to hear the Washington Times quoted every hour on the Voice of America and on the BBC, two worldwide radio networks that happen to reach hundreds of millions of people.
Also established were daily newspapers in other countries. In Uruguay, Últimas Noticias. In Egypt, the Middle East Times. In Japan, Seikai Nippo. And in Korea, the Segei Times. Reverend Moon also started magazines, like the news weekly Insight, as well as The World and I, a massive monthly publication of 700 pages, featuring the world's best scholarship and culture. The print media are complemented by broadcasting ventures, including the Washington Television Center in the United States and One World Productions in Japan. Bringing together these very different worlds of electronic and print media is the World Media Association. From the beginning, the World Media Association sponsored fact-finding tours for responsible journalists to the world's flashpoints. It would also bring together members of the Fourth Estate to an annual conference where the media's problems and opportunities would be discussed and debated. All this activity has not gone unnoticed. Some have questioned why a religious leader should spend so much effort on building a communications empire in the first place. Reverend Moon's reply: "My reason is quite simple. It is because I recognize the power of the media to do the will of God. The latter half of the 20th century is an age dominated by communication. My ultimate desire is to achieve lasting world peace, a peace based upon a system of true values. The achievement of this goal is far more likely to be determined by the work of the media than by military might. Communications is one key, but ideas are another. To foster serious thought in a difficult age of transition and upheaval, Reverend Moon has founded numerous organizations, such as the Association for the Unity of Latin America and the Summit Council for World Peace. Both are organizations that bring together former heads of state and other world leaders to promote peace and the welfare of all mankind. One expression of human thought is technology. Here, Reverend Moon has been a champion of spreading technology from developed to underdeveloped nations. But he has done more than simply talk. This is today's China, and a bold new project, the Panda Motors Corporation. Reverend Moon intends to invest $1 billion in the plant. The goal? To produce 300,000 subcompact cars by the mid-1990s. These Chinese-made vehicles are destined for both the domestic market and the burgeoning markets of Asia, Africa, South America, and eventually the world. For Reverend Moon, Panda's purpose is development, not profit. He has pledged that no money will be remitted from China, but will be plowed back into the enterprise, serving the interests of more than 1 billion people. For Reverend Moon, business profits have always served a moral purpose, and that without them, his real mission could not be accomplished. He also believes that only through the spread of advanced technology can the planet's social, economic, and political disparities be overcome. Overcoming them poses one of the most fundamental challenges of mankind. But there are others equally challenging. Reverend Moon believes that without the cooperation of the Soviet Union and its leaders, peace could not be achieved and man could not survive. One of the ways Reverend Moon is working to bring this about is through cultural exchange. In 1990, Reverend Moon established the Universal Ballet Academy in Washington, D.C. The Academy is under the artistic direction of Oleg Vinogradov, director of the Kirov Ballet. Students are educated by the most qualified and highly trained teachers from Leningrad's Kirov Ballet. It isn't surprising, then, that a man from Korea would want to go to the Soviet Union. It was a promise he first made in 1976 and fulfilled in April 1990. There, under the auspices of the World Media Association, 400 international journalists gathered with several hundred colleagues from the Soviet Union to discuss and debate the impact of global communications. It was not without its ironies, as Reverend Moon himself pointed out. Some people in the West, especially those who are afraid of me, thought that it would be impossible to have the World Media Conference take place in Moscow. They were sure that the Soviet Union would never grant me a visa. They thought that the Soviet government would never allow such a conference. I must say that I feel admiration and deep respect for your leaders, and also for your media. They are very well informed. They know all the truth about me. They realized that Reverend Moon's visit to Moscow would be beneficial for the Soviet Union and granted me a visa. And this very successful conference took place. At the same time, the Summit Council for World Peace and the Association for the Unity of Latin America brought together some 60 former heads of state to discuss the meaning of perestroika and glasnost. But as dramatic as these encounters were, they paled in comparison to the meeting of Sun Myung Moon and Mikhail Gorbachev. These two men who represent very different worldviews came together finally in a friendly exchange. Reconciliation was very much on their minds as the Soviet leaders struggled with enormous and growing domestic problems. For the Russian people and the other peoples of the old empire, Reverend Moon expressed hope that their great suffering would be turned by God into a victory over spiritual decay and despair. That view was expressed in a book especially prepared for the meeting in Moscow, written in English and Russian. It conveyed the Koreans' message of hope and reconciliation. In a troubled land, Reverend Moon's own mission to Moscow was big news in the Soviet Union. And why not? He was to the old generation of Soviet leaders an intractable enemy. Among the things he had been called by the Soviet propaganda apparatus were swindler in a gown and a worshiper with a mortar. Once he had been accused of being an agent for the South Korean and American intelligence services. But not this time, not now, in Moscow, April 1990. As a Novosti news agency commentator put it in a television documentary that covered the visit of Reverend Moon, since the laws of morality that Moon preaches are no different than the 10 Universal Commandments, there is no reason why Reverend Moon can't be with us. Furthermore, Reverend Moon strives to ban nuclear weapons and save the environment, as well as we do. Now the Soviets accepted him as a man of peace and reconciliation, and the Korean openly acknowledged that President Gorbachev's policies had helped heal the difference between East and West. That President Gorbachev had courageously allowed the peoples of Eastern Europe to find their own destiny. And it was President Gorbachev, Reverend Moon said, who finally lifted the Iron Curtain. At least some Soviet leaders were inclined to agree. Albert Vlasov, chairman of the Novosti press agency. Truly revolutionary changes are taking place in our country. Perestroika and glasnost brought about positive change in the world towards more open relations based upon the moral code of universal values. The main thing that determines people's attitudes today is the growing understanding of the unity of our world, of the integrity of our common fate on earth. And finally, glasnost means an ability to face the truth, to listen and understand others. It also means giving up the practice of cynical political command, the habits of taking into account only our own views and assessments. Reverend Moon also talked with Soviet journalists as well as other leading Soviet officials. At a special award ceremony, Reverend Moon's Summit Council for World Peace presented the prestigious Medal of Unity and Freedom to 3 top Soviet leaders. A man of peace, Reverend Moon is also a man of truth. And with Novosti, Reverend Moon did not mince words about the new time of troubles for the Russian people. Frankly, I'm very disappointed. I see no affluence here. The Communist Manifesto declared that a true paradise would be built for people. I don't see it. On the contrary, I see a lot of suffering, bad economic structure, and even lack of food, of the most ordinary things. And I realize that the system doesn't work here. There is no force in this country to lead its people to prosperity. Ideology of denial of God, brought about by Marx and Lenin, proved to be wrong. All these portraits on the walls have to disappear. You have to find real glasnost and perestroika, redo your whole society, and establish freedom and prosperity for your people. And Reverend Moon was worried about the future of the country. You are trying to change abruptly your political system. It can't be done overnight. Imagine a building, and you take out its basement. The building will collapse. What you really need is support and understanding of the free world, cooperation. It is necessary that socialism and the free market system make peace. The process is already in progress. But you have to restore what the communist system had initially destroyed, private property. You have to restore it quickly, otherwise people wouldn't have any incentive to work. To the surprise of some, the government treated Reverend Moon as an honored state guest. He stayed at the Oktoberskaya Hotel, usually reserved for the Soviet elite, but he spent little time at the hotel. His schedule included receptions, press conferences, and the speech which opened the World Media Conference. For the newly liberated Soviet press, Reverend Moon and the World Media Conference became the lead story of the week. Interviews, speeches, and performances were featured each night on the national nightly news. In fact, the World Media Conference proved to be lively and occasionally confrontational. The retired editor of USA Today, Al Newhart, no stranger himself to controversy, laid down his own views on where the world press was going.
But there can be little argument that the media today is setting the global agenda more so than our politicians or economists or academicians.
Soviet, Japanese, and other journalists exploited glasnost to the limit. It was all very new for a society which once, and not so long ago, had only one official view, dutifully reported by a state-controlled media. But there was uncertainty too. Richard Pipes, an American Soviet expert. A democratic Soviet Union is not dangerous. A totalitarian Soviet Union is very dangerous. If the totalitarian order in the Soviet Union is turned into a democratic one, we will be able to coexist much better than before. At the same time, the Summit Council's deliberations were carried on in a more diplomatic tone, and there was a surprise. Current and former leaders would also meet with President Gorbachev, thanks to Reverend Moon. Among them, Joseph Luns, former Secretary General of NATO, Salvador Laurel, Vice President of the Philippines, and Jami-Zell Singh, former President of India. Following this meeting, Reverend Moon and his wife met privately with President Gorbachev in his Kremlin office. And what did the Soviets think about all of this? One Russian reporter put it this way: no doubt that it was an excellent idea to have this conference in Moscow. It is in Moscow that history is made today. But it wasn't quite over. The closing event was held at the Moscow Children's Palace Performing Arts Theater, where the Little Angels performed. It was another first. No other non-Soviet group had ever performed there before. In attendance, Raisa Gorbachev, who met the children backstage after the performance. And finally, Reverend Moon offered his closing comments to the conference participants, sharing with them his insights on that private conversation with President Gorbachev.
Mr. Gorbachev's burden is great, and his mission is difficult. It is only with God on his side that he can win the victory. His nation will play a central role in God's providence in the coming decade. As a religious leader, I firmly believe that a God-centered worldview offers the solution of all problems. Atheistic theories centered only on man being disaster and self-destruction in the end This is a universal principle true in both the East and the West. Let us work together to support glasnost and peacemaker in the Soviet Union. Let us work together for lasting world peace.
It was also Reverend and Mrs. Moon's 30th wedding anniversary. In Moscow, this too would be a new beginning to a lasting relationship.
And thank you for the Moscow night, particularly and for telling you
For Reverend Moon and his family, Moscow meant an important stop on a long journey toward world peace and reconciliation. That journey is not over, but in April 1990, Reverend Moon had reached an important milestone. And two, Sun Myung Moon would continue to use, as he has in the past, all his movement's resources in communications, high technology, industry, culture, and ideas to help build a lasting peace for a suffering mankind. For him, it would be a peace based on God's love for the people of the Soviet Union and the world.